In this second mini lecture, I want to take what we've talked about in the Alfano et al. Technological seduction and use it to segue into T. Nguyen's article on echo chambers and epistemic bubbles, and to explain a little bit about where this is going in the next couple of lectures. Next slide. So we ended the Alfano et al. Mini lecture by sort of describing what his strategy was. But I want to ask a couple of critical questions of the Alfano article. First, what exactly is their concern? Right, so they phrase the title. The title of the paper is Technological Seduction and Self-Radicalization, and so obviously they're concerned about something. Those are fairly loaded terms. Those are obviously things that sound bad. But what exactly is it? We might think that the project is merely descriptive, right? All they're doing is describing a kind of phenomena that happens, a way of being drawn in to particular kinds of rhetoric, right? There's a particular structure of it, and this allows for people to be drawn into kind of increasingly emotionally loaded or emotionally charged informational content within their informational environments. And this can lead them to sort of going down a path of increasingly agreeing with more and more incendiary information or incendiary imperatives that others post online, right? So maybe they're just describing that as a phenomenon. And there's an open question of how often this happens, what to do about it, and things like that. So one way to think about the Alfano article is that technological seduction simply falls into a pattern of other kinds of ways that people get drawn into beliefs that are particularly strident and potentially turn antisocial, right? So that's, I think, a plausible way of understanding what Alfano's project is. Next slide. I think what's interesting, though, is that the T. Nguyen article is a nice way of explaining what's at stake in a broader way. So T. Nguyen is a philosopher. He's at the University of Utah now, and he works in this area. He's an epistemologist. That is, he works on how people come to know things. That is, what it means for people to know things in the context in which we can say that propositional beliefs are justified, are true, are likely to be true, and things like that. Right. So that's what he studies. And this particular article is based on a phenomenon that's been known for a couple of decades, right? So in the 90s, Nicholas Negroponte wrote a fairly famous, several things are fairly famous, describing something that he calls the daily me. And the idea was that even back in the 1990s, it was becoming clear that people could have their information environments tailored very much to the stuff that they care about. Now, in some ways, that makes a lot of sense, right? You can cultivate your news feeds. You can describe what news services you might read daily or listen to, or if you subscribe to newspapers, which one you'll subscribe to, what channels you'll watch on the television, things like that, right? So this isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? But it was pointed out that this becomes increasingly easy when we encounter information in online environments. That is, when we're isolated and we have a broad array of choices about what we'll actually view, we can tailor those fairly narrowly. However, that's in contrast to if you have a limited array of newspapers that one can subscribe to, or channels that you can watch on TV, or magazines you can subscribe to, and so forth, right? So your ability to tailor things increases as ease of access to information and breadth of information available increases, right? So this is a phenomenon that's old, but it comes out in interesting kinds of ways. And there's an example that I describe in a book and a couple of papers, and is fairly famous at this point. Representative Justin Amash was a member of the U.S. House of Representatives from Michigan, member of the Republican Party at the time, and back in 2019, after the publication of special investigation, special investigation into Russian interference in U.S. elections of 2016, headed by former director of the FBI, Robert Mueller. After this report was published, lots of people had the impression that that report did not have anything negative to say about people currently at the time in the U.S. government, particularly the president and people who are members of the president's administration and people who are participated in the president's campaign. And people just assumed that that report had only positive things to say. In fact, this is untrue. The report had a substantial amount of description of ways in which various people in the United States coordinated with or sought information from hostile foreign actors and impeded investigation into foreign interference in U.S. elections, right? So that particular matter, what your views of that is irrelevant here. What's important is this report was public. It was easily available. You could get audio versions. It was available for free and was widely reported on. But lots of people thought that it had very little negative findings in it. And Representative Justin Amash at the time was, even though he's a member of the same party as the President of the United States, was thought that there should be further legal action taken on the basis of this report and other investigations that had taken place at the time. He went to a number of constituent meetings, town hall meetings in his district, and lots of people there who attended these town halls had no idea. They thought they just did not know. They believed falsely that the report said one thing, though Justin Amash said, look, it does. It has lots of information about coordination between a campaign and hostile foreign actors, solicitation of negative information, failure to report to the FBI, as well as impeding of investigation and interference and things like that, right? So this is big contrast, right? And so what's interesting here is not what you think of Justin Amash or the administration or people who didn't know. Rather, it's a descriptive phenomenon, right? That there's a very easily accessible and widely reported and fairly easy to read report that came out, and people just, their information environments were such that they believed something utterly false about the contents of this report, right? And that's interesting, right? People aren't acting irrationally. People aren't acting necessarily in bad faith, at least the people who are consumers of information. Rather, it is a phenomenon that Nguyen and others refer to as epistemic bubbles. Next slide. Now, what's an epistemic bubble? An epistemic bubble, Nguyen provides a definition. Other people will give different accounts, but Nguyen is very good. He's a very precise philosopher in this way. And he defines an epistemic bubble as an informational network from which relevant voices have been excluded by omission, right? And the idea is that there are important facts or important voices in the previous example about, say, an investigation that was promulgated by the U.S. Department of Justice with the imprimatur of the United States Senate that gathered and reported lots of information, and that had not penetrated lots of people who assumed they were informed about relevant facts about the state of the United States at the time. And the idea here is that because people's information environments may be circumscribed or limited or within a bubble, they may not learn really important stuff, don't hear important other perspectives. Now, this doesn't require that one hear all perspectives, right? Some perspectives are not worthwhile. They may not be necessary for what one does to go about one's life. But this is, again, a descriptive phenomena that Nguyen is talking about. In fact, next slide. Epistemic bubbles are actually really important in many ways. We rely on epistemic bubbles because the world is such that it's incredibly complex, and there are lots of different voices, lots of different types of information that we can potentially pay attention to, and it's extremely effective to tune in to a narrow range of information or curate one's information environment so that one can actually not just be in the middle of a welter of information all the time, right? So in one sense, epistemic bubbles are necessary for us to simply function. Next slide. But that's, it's important that whatever bubble one has is curated in such a way that it doesn't exclude important other information, right? So there's a couple ways that having an epistemic bubble can be particularly bad, right? So for one, and Nguyen uses this example, but suppose you are in the middle of a group of well-informed people, right? You associate it with people who are broad-minded, they're smart, they consume lots of information, they may have expertise in lots of different areas. It's almost impossible to assure, or it's very difficult to ensure, that whatever circle of people that you interact with or gain information from will have what Sandy Goldberg refers to as coverage reliability. That is, people cover a broad enough array of information that your information environment will cover all of the things that you want to know about. So maybe you have people who are informed about politics in or governance in your particular community. Maybe you have people who understand basics of public health. Maybe you have people who understand basics of finance. Others who understand macroeconomics, right? There's still, regardless of how big your array of network is, how broad your network is, there's going to be lots of people who are lots of areas of the world, areas of understanding that you can't possibly have within your immediate circle, right? So the problem is that even if you have a reliable group or a reliable array of information, it will never have sufficient coverage reliability, right? So there needs to be some permeability of whatever kind of curated information environment that you actually have, right? Permeability is important because no matter what you do, you will not have coverage reliability over everything that may become relevant at some point, right? So thing one. Thing two, the more constrained one's bubble is, it can lead to a phenomenon where you're excessively confident in what you believe, right? If everybody, if you have a relatively narrow range of perspectives and degrees of expertise, that is, people having expertise around you and being knowledgeable and broad-minded around you, if there's not sufficient breadth, if there's not sufficient range of views, then you're likely to have excessive confidence in what you think, even in coordination with those other people. Right? And it's important to have a degree of epistemic humility. What that means is just a degree of skepticism about your own beliefs. Very important to always sort of go back and be able to revise what one thinks, right? And excessive confidence based on epistemic bubbles is contrary to that. Next slide. But bubbles, according to Nguyen, and the way Nguyen is setting up this conceptual framework, are easily thwarted, or put more positively, they aren't that bad. Why aren't they that bad? Well, it's easy to get past, right? Exposing yourself to new perspectives or doing further curation of your information bubble, your information environment in order to incorporate more perspectives, or learning from somebody else by encountering people outside your normal epistemic bubble, makes it easy to pop that bubble, right? And I want you to be careful of metaphors here. Don't use metaphors excessively, but the bubble metaphor is built into the concept, so I'll do it a little bit here. And the idea is that, yeah, some kind of bubble is necessary, but that's easily surpassable, easily surmountable. Echo chambers, in contrast, according to Wynne, are really insidious. They're particularly bad and worrisome. The reason they're particularly bad and worrisome is that they can undermine what Nguyen calls the social conditions of knowledge. Next slide. And so here, I think it's worth taking a quick detour into social epistemology. Now, we've encountered the term epistemology before. Epistemology is just the study of what knowledge is, what it means to know something. And a classical understanding of epistemology, or knowledge, is the view that knowledge is justified true belief. And the idea is that one needs to, in order to know something, one has to believe it. You don't know something that you don't believe. That belief can't just come from anywhere. It needs to be justified. And you can't know some proposition unless it's true. And that's sort of a classic understanding of what knowledge is. Now, you don't have to worry about that particular definition, except to understand that it doesn't work in the sense, or it only works in the sense that justification of knowledge has to come from other people, right? So all of us depend deeply on other people to know stuff about the world, right? To know anything about the natural world requires that we base our inferences on what other people have discovered. That in turn, other people's discoveries depend in turn upon construction of equipment that is used to make observations. It is dependent upon people organizing that information. It's dependent upon people conveying that information in a way that's useful, right? And you can sort of understand this just by looking at any research article. So go to a scientific publication, Nature, Science, any scientific journal, actually any academic journal, and a very large number of articles are going to have multiple authors, right? So some articles, particularly ones involving lots of instrumentation and lots of data analysis, are going to have 10, 20, sometimes 40 or 50 authors, because each particular person brings a particular area of expertise to a project, right? So it's a social endeavor. Likewise, I mean, think about just news reporting, right? Some people go out, and some journalists may go out and do some research and write an article, but it also requires that they depend upon other sources, people to convey facts to them. It requires that be organized. It requires that it be coordinated with other understandings, right? So the idea is that all of us, to know anything about the world, have to engage in this really socially interconnected process. There's very little that we can know just on our own. Moreover, this process depends upon trust, right? So as you endeavor your education, it requires that the people who you interact with, other students, instructors, librarians, engage in a good faith effort in order to help you work through your own understandings of things, right? So deeply socially interactive process, and it demands trust. If you can't trust anybody to guide your path, to report faithfully, to act in good faith efforts, then knowledge as a social process just falls apart, right? I think that's fairly clear. Next slide. back to echo chambers. The problem with echo chambers, and this is, I think, Nguyen's insight, is that echo chambers don't just curate our information environment, as in epistemic bubbles. Rather, they aim to delegitimize different views as fundamentally untrustworthy, right? So the problem with echo chambers is that they deny the possibility that people who disagree with them, people cultivating echo chambers, aim to deny that people disagreeing with them are possible sources of understanding, right? And so if one is advancing or promulgating an echo chamber and trying to show that people who disagree with one's views or the things that one's claims are true are fundamentally untrustworthy, then the stuff that disagrees with the view inside of an echo chamber will be automatically delegitimized, right, by the mere fact that they disagree. And this creates a kind of feedback loop, right? So ostensibly countervailing evidence within an echo chamber is interpreted as a reason to think that the source itself is fundamentally unreliable, right? So if a news organization reports something you don't like, and you use that not as a piece of evidence, or even discounting it and just simply not believing that source, it's actually a reason to think that everything that that source says is unreliable, right? So this is the insidious thing about echo chambers on Nguyen's view. And I think this is an interesting view because it undermines this key part of knowledge itself, namely a kind of trust in the social processes by which we can come to understand things. Next slide. And what's interesting about this is that the mechanism of an echo chamber looks a lot like a rational process, right? So if you're discounting a source, you're not simply just denying a claim that the source makes. Rather, you are thinking critically or thinking about the fact that some sources are indeed unreliable. So it looks like critical thinking because, sure, it's rational to discount some kinds of sources. But the problem is that echo chambers, when they are indeed echo chambers, are not acting in a way that discounts sources for the right reasons, right? So if you discount, for example, public health agencies, because, just to take a current controversy about, say, vaccine hesitancy, right? If you think that vaccines are harmful or they're not too good or something like that, and they ought not be required, or public health agencies ought not promulgate wide-scale vaccination, you might think that the mere fact that public health organizations push vaccination is grounds to think that the public health agency is acting in bad faith, right? That's different than simply disagreeing, than simply disbelieving them. It's thinking that that source is consistently unreliable, right? And yet, public health agencies, for the most part, are not that way, at least at the moment. And they don't justify treating them as consistently unreliable, right? What should happen is that one discount sources that act in bad faith, sources that are indeed consistently unreliable or engage in unreliable methods, right? So the key thing to distinguish here, the key insight to Nguyen, is that there's this second order process, this second order issue of being critical of sources to the right extent and for the right reasons. Next slide. So once we understand what Nguyen's view is, namely that echo chambers are particularly insidious because they undermine trust, or they're aimed, or they tend to undermine the social trust necessary for us to gain knowledge at all, to actually have a functioning knowledge and understanding based community and society. But so what, right? So there's he offers this idea of social epistemic reboots. He bases that, he has this digression, it's not a digression, he has this part in the article that goes back to Rene Descartes' view of radical skepticism. Descartes is a 17th century philosopher who tried to build up a system of knowledge that didn't depend on fallible sources like one's senses and reporting from others. And the idea was Descartes tried to build a system in which he could trust various kinds of knowledge, right? And what Nguyen does is think about ways in which that same kind of trust in social processes can be kindled. And he gives an example of somebody coming from a white supremacist background, a very, very smart person who had grown up in a explicitly white supremacist family and had gone on to encounter people who were different, thought differently from him, and built a kind of trust. Such that the person started to realize their views were not well supported, and there were alternatives, right? But here's the thing: Nguyen wants to make this point about epistemic bubbles and echo chambers, and then he has this correct, in my view, he has this understanding about the necessity of social trust in knowledge creation and the social nature of knowledge, but it doesn't tell us a lot. Like the connection for Nguyen between Nguyen's framework and this course, data, algorithms, and ethics, is unclear. And that's what I hope we can start to look at after this week to start to consider. So next slide. We'll leave it here before we get to some interesting readings in the coming weeks. First, recommender systems. So the kind described by Alfano et al., they can feed both epistemic bubbles and echo chambers, right? We can be fed news and fed information that is closely related to what we already think and may not get us outside of the epistemic or the intellectual or informational environments that we've curated for ourselves, right? So social media and other kinds of recommender systems can foster both epistemic bubbles and echo chambers. Second, that's not necessarily bad, right? It can be bad on the ground, in part because there are some particularly pernicious uses of recommender systems, especially where people promulgate stuff based on bad faith, right? And bad faith is a betrayal of trust in a sense, and that can warrant greater intervention. And this, looking ahead to weeks 13 and 14, will be important where these things are cumulative. So what we're going to look at is disinformation and misinformation campaigns that go beyond some people advancing false beliefs and instead go towards systematic bad faith actions or systematic disinformation campaigns that undermine foundations of not just knowledge and belief and social processes and knowledge and belief, but can undermine what I'll refer to as democratic legitimacy. They can undermine the degree to which people have reasonable beliefs about what's going on where they live, in their polities. And that is particularly pernicious, which we'll dive into in more depth in weeks 13 and 14. End of presentation.